I wanted to kind of speaking about the position that you are in, being in Poland with the Russia-Ukraine conflagration happening essentially next door from our perspective here in the States. How has it been from your vantage point? And you can answer that from any particular angle you want.
Right. Okay, so we're now a month into the conflict.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, I mean, there was kind of a panic for sure in Poland. People withdrawing money, rushing to get passports if they didn't have them already, of course. Yeah, and there was a widespread fear that it was going to escalate, which I think this fear has died down somewhat, but it certainly hasn't gone away completely, because there is so much uncertainty, of course, around this war. But soon enough, the focus on the possibility of a bigger conflict kind of got displaced really by the arrival of refugees, and talking a lot of refugees. I think probably up to about 2 million now. Yeah, and Poland is a country of under 40 million people, I believe.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're looking at like about 5%, right? So they arrived. I've got a friend of mine who works for a Polish NGO.
Yeah.
And he's a pretty interesting source of information about this. And he told me like the first wave of refugees were basically wealthy Ukrainians, arriving in their cars, usually their own cars, and driving those cars into Poland and just carrying on their lives here. Really, and we have seen, my wife and I, we have seen some of these cars going around Krakow. We didn't see too many Ukrainian number plates before, and now we see them from time to time. So that was the first wave, and then after that came more kind of ordinary Ukrainians, really. Because people who have resources, the wealthy ones, they got out pretty quick.
It's interesting. It's interesting you're seeing Ukrainian plates. I mean, I don't even associate that with refugees at all. When I think about refugees coming from North Africa, I don't think about what an Algerian license plate looks like, or
right.
I mean, they must exist. So it's just that's a manifestation of me being fairly isolated over here, I guess. Maybe if I were in a border state with Mexico, I might see some of this myself.
Right. Well, a lot of refugees, came not in their own cars. They came on trains or just on foot. Even, they made their way to the border somehow. Mostly women and children, of course, the vast majority, really, women and children. The men, of course, have to stay behind, really, except for very, sort of elderly men. Stay to fight the Russians, really. In terms of the way the country reacted, I think it's really it was really impressive how just ordinary people just stepped up, and a lot of them, a lot of people went to the border of their own accord and just took refugees really to their homes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other things I've seen, kind of like people leaving. In America, strollers, you call them strollers, right? For babies, prams in British English, stroller, for like a baby.
I think they're called prams.
Prams, yeah, I would say pram, I think British, but but people have been leaving those at train stations, for people the Ukrainians to use.
Yeah.
But the whole thing, talking to my NGO friend. He says the whole thing is kind of being pretty ad hoc, kind of made up as people going along, really. And he told me that he got, I think it was last week, he got a sort of phone call from some Jesuits in Portugal, right? And these Jesuits said, we would like to invite people to stay, refugees to stay in Lisbon, and we can accommodate 150 refugees, paying full board for all the food and everything for 6 months. And well, first of all, my friend said, okay, I need to check out these people, who they are, and because you never know, right? It could be somebody trying to pull a fast one, some people traffickers or whatever.
Yeah.
So he started phoning around.
He would be pushing them even deeper into the EU, perhaps
Right.
mistakenly, if they are of a nefarious sort of intent.
I mean, this is, we know this is going on, yeah. And part of the problem is as I say, this ad hoc, kind of arrangements, really, that you can just go to a lot of refugees are sleeping at train stations, and you can just kind of go along to a train station, leave your details there, and take some refugees with you to your home. So anyway, he rang around. He couldn't get a straight answer about what to do about this until somebody said, well, the deputy mayor of Krakow, this is in Krakow, yeah, is in charge of all this for the city, so you should phone him. So he did, and he said, what's the procedure? My friend said, what's the procedure? And the deputy mayor said, there is no procedure. You just do what you think is best. So anyway, he contacted then the local Jesuits, and asked them to check out this group, and they checked them out, and they're legit, yeah. So they were invited to Krakow. They came, they flew.
Yeah. So it seems a little daunting to do background checks on approximately 150 people. Do they sort of like narrow that down right away by not looking into the backgrounds of obviously any children, maybe most of the women, maybe anyone elderly, and so they're really just kind of looking into the backgrounds of men between the ages of 20 and 60 or something? I don't know.
I don't know, because unfortunately it wasn't very successful. These Jesuits came from Portugal, and they invited. They said we will invite people, Ukrainian refugees, to Lisbon, but they could only find 10 people willing to go. Can you believe it? 10 people.
Well, they might have. They're thinking, I made it to Poland. That's good enough. I mean, I have hopes of getting back to Ukraine. I'd rather not move even deeper into.
That's it. Yeah.
I mean, it just sort of makes sense. I mean,
I think it's a big psychological thing, to go much further west, especially when the men folk still in Ukraine.
Right. They might. Yeah.
So they couldn't. They were rather. My friend said these Jesuits were rather disappointed by the response. So I don't know if they took these 10 or what. I'm not sure. But he says that there was a big big enthusiasm to begin with. Lots of people volunteering to help process the refugees and things like that. But also to house them, etc.
Yeah.
And now that as the kind of grind of this sinks in, kind of like processing, for example, taking details down day after day, then some of that enthusiasm is kind of waning a bit. But the government has given them I think free train travel, I think, to refugees. It's talking about, I think, I'm not sure if it's done this yet, but it's talking about giving them child support, which Polish people get, it's money for each child. So Ukrainians will get that, and that's completely unprecedented, really, for non-citizens.
So this is monetary child support, not just certain centers where they can bring children to be looked after, or like sort of free daycare type of thing. This is
that's it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And they've changed the law to increase the class sizes for children. But this is all it's getting a bit controversial, I would say, because the Polish government said, we will welcome however many refugees want to come here. And some people are kind of disgruntled about that, and think, that wasn't the best thing to say. That maybe that some of them should be sent on, some of them are going to places like Germany and so on, but, that maybe there should be some upper limit to the number of refugees because, as I say, under 40 million people, not the wealthiest country in the world. So,
right.
It's a bit of
it's interesting because Poland itself has been the source of economic migrants, I think, not actually refugee, but, into Britain. So Poland has been a source country for migrants into Britain. And, that has created some tensions, not as much as, Muslims coming from the Middle East or North Africa, but has created some tension. And so now Poland itself is seeing an influx of foreigners.
That's right.
So,
yeah.
And then, in a way, the British might react to Polish, is interesting.
Yeah. There's an important point, though, that many Poles, some of my friends have refugees, sort of, not refugees, but relatives in Ukraine, that at the end of the Second World War, borders were moved, of course, Polish borders were moved. Poland got some territory from Germany, and some of the Polish territory went to Soviet Union, to Belarus and Ukraine. But not, and there were quite a few people who displaced were moved, westward, but not everybody by all means, so, or by any means. So that, there are these connections between the countries, sort of, blood connections, I would say. And I think this has a bit, this is an important factor in all of this, really.
Yeah. How different is the Ukrainian language and the Polish language? Is it like orders of magnitude such that any inkling of an understanding between two native speakers is just pretty much impossible? Or was there some kind of lineage there, of language sort that I'm not aware of?
There is some similarity for sure, but of course Ukrainian is much closer to Russian. And the alphabet is Cyrillic, of course. But there are, it's possible, I think, for, on a very basic level, for the two individuals from the different countries to understand each other. Of course, most of the younger people speak English. Most Polish people, especially younger people, do speak English at some level, right? So. That is, it's not that difficult to communicate. But yeah, I think with the elderly people, of course, elderly refugees, it can be a bit more difficult then.
Yeah, I'm guessing Polish are more versed in English than the typical Ukrainian.
Actually, I've heard that younger Ukrainians have often got pretty good English. I haven't met them yet. Although I did know some. I have met some from work over the years, but I haven't met any refugees yet. But as I understand it, their education system in Ukraine seems to be pretty good. Yeah, and I heard that some of these kids who are kind of starting in Polish schools and they're given some material and they say, well, we already did this. We've already done this in our school. So.
Me making that assumption is sort of a dated perspective. It's like at this point, I find the theme of a globalization that is not American sort of fascinating. At this point, globalization is so. That cat is so far out of the bag, and it's not primarily even led by America per se. Although English still seems to have made massive inroads, but at this point, it's just sort of a background condition of modernity. You don't even necessarily tie to some kind of American or Anglo-American cultural imperialism. it just is what it is.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, I don't know when we would sort of mark the end of globalization proper. I would say maybe either sort of towards the end of George W. Bush's presidency or the beginning of Obama's presidency. But I think when it became clear that Iraq and Afghanistan were not going to be successful wars, then I think that kind of vision of the ever kind of Fukuyama vision of the triumph of liberal democracy just kind of fell apart really. I think that was the end of globalization, because that basically was globalization, right? I mean, in its classical form. So
yeah. What happens when globalization continues, but not on these sort of American-led terms, and in the implications, the way that rather, I should say, permutations of globalization begin to become difficult to understand, actually, if you are within the sort of core, the old school core being, Anglo-American culture.
yeah.
And so much globalization now is happening at the periphery. Its own sort of localized forms of one nation state or one national culture being subsumed or infiltrated by another, but it's happening in so many disparate forms now that it's hard to stay on top of it.
Yeah, I mean, both Baudrillard had sort of made a distinction between the universal, which is a kind of an Enlightenment idea, really, and the kind of idea of kind of everyone converging on some kind of set of liberal kind of ideals, human rights and so on, democracy, etc. And then he made a distinction between that and what he called the global. And the global is much more about sort of technology, markets, and sort of spread of those things. And he believed that the universal was dying out. And this was something about 20 years ago in an interview. He said this.
I'm sorry.
The globe.
I'm sorry. Once again, who said this? Was this Fukuyama?
This is Baudrillard, Jean Baudrillard.
Okay.
Yeah. He thought the universal was on its way out, but the global would, of course, continue.
Yeah.
So I think what we see. I mean, we see obviously, countries like China becoming, more and more technologically advanced, and in some ways ahead of the US and Europe, I think. Maybe not in every department, but in some departments. That doesn't go hand in hand with sort of liberal values necessarily. So human rights or democracy.
Yeah, there was do you recall the book Jihad versus McWorld by Benjamin Barber?
That rings a bell, but I never read it.
Yeah, the early 2000s when, yes, this idea of the end of history was only beginning to get contested, but on the terms of radical Islamic terrorism, where that some kind of what they called it fourth generation warfare, this kind of sporadic nipping at the heels of the American global empire was something that was just going to have to be lived with in perpetuity, but no major rival was going to displace it. There was another book called Golden Arches East, which also kind of riffed on the theme of specifically American-led cultural imperialism being somehow pushed back on, or in this case, the case of this book, Golden Arches East, it was about McDonald's spreading in China. The subtext was more not being pushed back on the American-led cultural project, but all this time out, we're seeing that not only are kind of non-state actors pushing back on it, but other state actors as well. But what's interesting is they're not pushing back by laying out some kind of alternative to capitalism. It's just their own form of capitalism. It's a capitalism that is more that has sort of a national imperatives and national cultural imperatives at the heart of it, rather than the kind of let the chips fall where they may, liquid modernity, markets, leading their own way kind of angle, which seems to be still the American way.
Right. Yeah.
Rival forms of globalization, and to some extent rival forms of universalism, Really more the former than the latter. But yeah, that seems to be what it looks like now in 2022. Not like a basically American triumphalism, but only being challenged here and there by Islamic terrorists. We're way past that now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem to be any kind of alternative to capitalism now. That was the kind of, Mark Fisher's theme, in his capitalist realism. And, you look at Russia, you look at China, they all are basically capitalist countries, and they, as you say, they have some kind of variations. Maybe they're more nationalist.
The acronym TINA, or there is no alternative. I remember that getting around a lot.
There is no alternative. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, you have to face up to it that so the capital is just this kind of force in its own right, and it over the course of I don't know, a few centuries really, it has just expanded its kind of empire into every, I don't know, nook and cranny of human existence. I mean, when I look at things like OnlyFans, you can say sort of capital is colonizing human relationships really at the most basic level. Also things like Tinder, sort of all those dating apps. Well, I think it's kind of like extending kind of the logic of the consumer lifestyle to relationships, and to kind of sex really, so that you can kind of you can get a get a I don't know, a partner like you get an Uber, right?
Right.
Something like that.